want to understand the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration.
Welcome back to the Unblocked Creators. Today, the Unblocked Creator in the spotlight is Paul Muso, who is a full-time philosophy professor and a solopreneur. After receiving his PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennyslvania, he decided to begin pursuing a career teaching philosophy online. His main focus is teaching people how to build their own philosophy of life, which he calls a micro-philosophy. His work is primarily found on Substack, and he just released a free course on Stoicism titled Philosophy as the Art of Living. So go ahead and check out the links in the description of this episode to check out Paul's online micro-philosophy course, and also enjoy philosophy as the art of living through his free course on Stoicism. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I've got to tell you about what's coming up for the creator economy. If solopreneur means anything to you, if you want to be a value creator online, maybe you're already writing online and trying to discover what you can offer the world through doing so, and how to get paid for it. How to get paid to live your dream instead of building somebody else's dream, working 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday for the rest of your life. The creator economy has been valued by Forbes at around $244 billion and is projected to more than double that by 2027. We all know that AI is drastically changing the shape of the modern world, and we are on course for a major shakedown. Humanity is not going to be able to go on with business as usual. So what is the business of the future? And what is creative work of the future? Well, my friends, I would like you to get a ticket to the Creator Economy Convention in Vancouver, British Columbia. The dates are set for 2026, June 5th to 7th. It's a 3-day-long convention held at the Vancouver Airport, Sheraton Vancouver Airport Hotel and Conference Center. There are, of course, links in the description for this episode. Go click the links to learn all about this upcoming event. But as a little preview for you, we have a lineup of speakers that are going to shake up the world, okay? At this in-person gathering, we'll have Dan Koh. If you've heard of Dan Koh, that's exciting news. We will have Hussein Ibarra. He's quite an expert in writing threads that go viral on X. And if you know about writing on X, you might know that it's one of the best ways to build a large internet audience that you can monetize by creating something valuable for them, helping people to transform their lives in a positive way. So Hussein Ibarra. We also have Brian Meyerhofer, who is doing incredible work making education around somatic therapy more accessible. And if you've seen some of my previous episodes, you might know somatic therapy is something that helped me heal 10 years of chronic back pain and also overcome years of struggling with substance use addiction. So somatic therapy, very cool topic, and he'll be talking about that in relation to being an online entrepreneur. So to me, a lot of the future of entrepreneurship is about understanding embodiment and returning to the body, understanding the mind-body connection. And if you spend hours a day sitting at your computer trying to build a business, it's very easy to lose touch with your breath and to lose contact with all the mild or seemingly minor stresses going on in your body that can build up to the point of drastically suppressing your consciousness, causing chronic pain and causing you to want to numb out at the end of the day. So I'm very excited to have Brian Meyerhofer. We'll also have Kimia Nora, an expert in neuroplasticity, talking to us about reprogramming the subconscious mind, also in relation to digital entrepreneurship. There are other speakers that I'm very excited to announce, but I won't drone on too long at this very moment. The next episode of this podcast will be with Dan Goldfield, who you can check out on YouTube and see how he teaches non-meditation, very interesting topic, and also built a 6-figure income from his couch, teaching spirituality. So these are all examples of people who have figured out how to free themselves from 9-to-5 work building someone else's dream, and instead make a meaningful contribution to the world through entrepreneurship in the age of the internet. Now, there are a lot of reasons why you should attend this in-person event. Of course, those speakers alone should have got attention from a lot of you. But if you're looking to build an online business, you know that the internet is increasingly dead content. That means it's AI generated with no soul. Not to poo-poo on AI. AI can do incredible things for leveraging creative work. But also, 14-year-old kids in their mother's basement can automate a process to create a bunch of scripts for AI-generated Bigfoot videos and get rich in the process by automating all of the analytics, optimization. Now look, some of those Bigfoot videos are pretty funny. I get it. And that's fine. But with over 50% of internet traffic now being driven by bots and an increasing amount of lazy people generating what would maybe be called AI slop, we must ask ourselves, what world do we really want to live in? What do we want to create? So, go check it out, thelivinginternet.com, or follow the Substack publication for all of the updates from me, other organizers, and the speakers of the event. The Substack organization is called the Living Internet Alliance, also linked in the show notes / description. So I'm very excited that many of you listening to this are going to be meeting us in person in Vancouver with real eye contact, real handshakes, and real hugs. And I can't wait to meet you. In the meantime, please enjoy this episode with someone who likely will be at the event next year, Mr. Paul Muso. Okay, welcome to the Unblocked Creators Podcast, Mr. Muso. It's good to have you here. So,
Thanks.
Paul, you and I have chatted a little bit and interacted through the social media stuff, but you're working on a project called The Microphilosopher and leading quite a few people now through that program. And you're a PhD philosophy teacher. So would you like to introduce a little bit of your background and what your background in philosophy is, and then we'll bridge as our conversation goes on, we'll bridge into more about what you're doing now.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. Super excited to be here. My background academically is in philosophy, in particular, Western analytic philosophy. That's how I was trained, so to speak. So I majored in philosophy as a freshman in college at Rutgers, and they're well known for being one of the world's leading analytic philosophy departments. Basically, this is a kind of tradition of philosophy that mostly comes from the United States and the UK, especially in the 20th century. That's when it kind of came into maturity. And in many ways, it's like science. You're trying to analyze the nature of reality or take any kind of philosophical question and break it down in a very precise, kind of logical way. So that's how I was trained. More recently, I've been kind of branching out into Eastern philosophy and trying to become more well-rounded and integrate that into some of the things I've been writing online. So I don't identify with that tradition anymore, but that's what I get paid to teach primarily. Outside of teaching philosophy courses, I have been working primarily on Substack, writing articles, and recently I just released a course called Micro Philosophy Foundations. And the central idea is to get everyone to build what I call their own micro philosophy, which is essentially just a philosophy for living, your own kind of personal philosophy for life, which I think everyone has some kind of belief system they live by, right? But I'm trying to help people think more clearly about it and more consciously kind of craft it for themselves, right? So I've been writing about that on Substack for a while, taking some of the ideas from academic philosophy and trying to make them more practical and publishing articles about how to do that. And now I have the course, which helps people kind of go through a step-by-step process in building this micro philosophy for themselves. And that is supposed to be inclusive and not only focus on Western thought, right? But it's supposed to be a kind of framework that anyone, whatever their background is, can use to help kind of organize their beliefs. So I'm really excited about that. It's become a big part of my life recently. And yeah, I think in the future, I'm going to continue moving in that direction. But I still love the things I learned through university, but, you know, moving on to bigger, better things now. Yeah.
Yeah. So in the analytic philosophy, that's mostly what you teach is grounded in. Could you share some of the basic topics or premises, or maybe also what's been of use, what has actually been of practical use to you in studying those topics?
Yeah. So whether I like it or not, learning about this style of philosophy has had a big influence on how I think and how I've been writing on the internet, how I've been developing this micro philosophy idea. So, one thing about analytic philosophy is that it's very focused on precision and logic. It's also very linguistic. So, there's a kind of faith that language will be able to be the tool through which we can represent the world accurately or not, right? Um, So, this kind of philosophy ultimately derives from ancient Greek philosophy, people like Aristotle and Plato, who were these sort of systematic, logically rigorous thinkers, and eventually made its way through Central and Western Europe to the UK. And in the 20th century, there were huge developments in mathematical logic and formal reasoning. And these developments really changed the face of philosophy in the West as we know it and made it into a kind of rigorous science, right? And then today, people conduct research trying to kind of use these tools, these logical tools, to answer philosophical questions. And it could be any question, pretty much any area of human life or thought has been subjected to this kind of analysis. Now, some people from other worldviews and traditions, right, are skeptical about this project, right, and whether analyzing language and using rigorous logical reasoning will get the job done, so to speak, or whether it's one way to do things, but not the only way, right? So there's a lot of kind of disagreements about that, but I found it useful in terms of helping people achieve more clarity in their beliefs and trying to articulate things that they've kind of implicitly held in their bodies and their minds. And I do think there's a benefit to doing that, even if the benefit ends up being that you hit the limit of what you can express through language or concepts, right? So but one goal I have is to help people kind of find how far they can go with something like language or concepts. And if they feel like it's not enough, right, then they have to look somewhere else, right? So I don't want to impose it on anyone, but I think it's a useful way to think. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of people who think about ancient Greek philosophy would probably think of there's probably three names that are most likely to come to people's minds, in my head at least, which would be Aristotle, Plato, and then Socrates. And Socrates, probably most quoted phrase might be, "The unexamined life is not worth living." So there it brings us to the question of uh, one, values, but also the ability to examine, right? So that means asking questions like you're referring to here about what tools can you use to examine life and reality. Um, so maybe we could also give a little bit of linguistic understanding for people who don't have a clear concept of what philosophy in essence really is, right? So, I mean, I've heard it broken down into philo and sophia, and meaning something along the lines of the love of wisdom. And as far as I understand, a lot of Socrates' uh, teachings or questioning was about the question of what is wisdom. Am I sort of onto the right path with that?
Yeah, for sure. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, especially with the micro philosophy idea. Um, how we think about the goal of philosophy, right? And traditionally, especially in the tradition that I was raised in, people think the goal is to pursue wisdom. Uh, the Greek term philosophia means love of wisdom. And there's a lot of ink that's been spilled on how to interpret what that really commits us to, right? Does loving wisdom mean that you um, pursue it your whole life, whether you can get it or not? Does it mean that you um, possess wisdom, right? I would say that recently I've become very interested in the idea that philosophy is a way of living. It's a certain kind of life. And this puts me at odds with how I've been trained, which typically treats philosophy as a way to produce knowledge, right? Kind of research project. So there's different ideas of what philosophy is, and a lot of these different interpretations depend on how you understand figures like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, what they were actually doing. But one thing for sure is that Greek philosophy was primarily something to be practiced. The modern research university did not exist in the ancient world, right? So when people practiced philosophy, they would go meet with a group of people at a gym or at a marketplace, and they would start talking about how to live, and then they would start doing some of the things they were talking about, right? In the same way that people might go study Buddhism and and spend some time on a monastery or something and actually change the behaviors that they're engaging in, right? That is not what you really get if you study philosophy at a university, right? There's no requirement for you to start drinking a certain way or eating certain foods.
Right. I pulled a quote from the Republic from Plato, which I think is mostly dialogues, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't read it in its entirety, but I enjoyed this quote, and I thought it really kind of seems relevant to what you're up to. So someone says, "Some will then be chosen for higher privilege. The studies which they pursued without order in their early years will now be brought together, and the students will see the relationship of these studies to one another and to truth." And then someone else responds, "Yes," he said, "that is the only kind of knowledge which takes lasting root." Thought that was interesting about seeing the relationship between the studies to one another and to truth. So it's like someone could study a lot of topics and memorize a lot of concepts and ideas and still somehow not do the work of seeing how that, or like integrating it into a worldview, right?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up truth because, yeah, you asked me a minute ago about what philosophy is, and I didn't mention truth at all. So, this is one reason you might think that it's not necessarily just a way of living, right? You might think that philosophy is the kind of pursuit of ultimate truth. And given that ultimate truth is quite difficult to attain, it's going to be this sort of endless pursuit, which does affect how you live if you're committed to the endless pursuit of wisdom or truth, right? So if you think about the aim of philosophy as truth, right, that gives it a very different shape and different requirements on you as a person, right? It requires that you get rid of false beliefs, that you do the work you need to find the truth, right? Whereas if you think of it as just a way of living, right, you might be living in a way that's not true. You might be living in a way that makes sense to you or that feels good for you, right? And it might be a coherent way of living, but most people, I think, want to live, at least to some extent, in alignment with what's true, right? So, truth has many different meanings. It's an interesting idea, but I think most people value truth. They think it's important, and it definitely has an impact on what you think philosophy is and what it kind of demands of you as a person. And obviously, like the quote you mentioned, education is a part of that, right? Very difficult to imagine someone discovering truth without going through some sort of education and thinking seriously about how the things that they are learning combine together and match up with reality, right?
Yeah. Well, that brings me to say it was interesting to hear you mention that you're becoming more interested in Eastern philosophy as well. That's been more what I've been drawn to. So, reading the Tao Te Ching or reading about the Buddha's teachings, or Zen, um, Zen Buddhism. And a lot of that seems to be a lot more about direct experience rather than uh, a lot of sort of academic conceptual knowledge. There's still a lot of teachings that people will study in those regards, but the Tao Te Ching, for example, is more like poetic and sort of almost cryptic seeming. And it's certainly not just looking at making clear logic based distinctions and definitions. So, what have you been finding out and discovering in understanding more Eastern philosophy?
Yeah. So I think you're right that the role of experience is very different in the kind of philosophy that I was trained in, this analytic, linguistic, logical tradition, which is quite recent. Right, experience in that tradition isn't as important. It's more about pure thought. Right, what can we learn about the world through pure thought and correct thinking? Right, whereas in this other tradition, right, there are certain things you can't learn about the world unless you have the experience, right? So that's one fundamental difference, right? Do we need to have certain experiences to attain wisdom or not, right? Is wisdom this sort of cognitive, intellectual thing that can be represented to our minds, right? Or is it something embodied, something that's difficult to express, right? But you kind of know it innately, or you kind of know it in your bones, right? And Eastern traditions, obviously, they have very complex texts and teachings and doctrines and examples that they use, but a lot of that is in service of cultivating a certain way of being, right? A way of living and doing and experiencing, right? So that is a big difference between how philosophy in the university is typically taught in the West and how it exists in Eastern cultures and history. But I actually think a lot of ancient Greek philosophy is not so different from the Eastern tradition. So that's why I've been interested in this philosophy as a way of life. You'll find that in the ancient world, most approaches to philosophy had this kind of practical, lived aspect to them, right? The goal was not just to write a treatise about the nature of the world, right? The goal was to improve your soul and to live the truth, right? And use the concepts to help you train your mind, right? To be more in alignment with nature or reality. So I think the way philosophy has existed in most of human history was very practical. And then this tradition of Western university philosophy, started to break off from that. And a big reason was the role of Christianity. In particular, the use of philosophy to kind of support theology and help Christian theologians kind of develop these complex proofs and analyses of concepts in Christianity, right? And those were that project existed in the university in the Middle Ages, right? And it became a very scholarly kind of bookish thing, right? Whereas, practicing Christians didn't really need to concern themselves with all that stuff, right? You could just live as a Christian. So, that carried on to the 20th century university, and, that had a big influence on the approach to philosophy that you typically would find in the university today.
Interesting. So what to go a little further back in time before we dive deeper into what you're doing now, what would you say first drew you to philosophy, and who were you as a young man who became interested in philosophy?
Yeah, well, as a young man, I was a kid who had a lot of freedom. So I grew up with a single mother, spent a lot of time unsupervised doing whatever I wanted. And typically that involved playing video games or just going outside and, playing sports. So, I had a very free life, and I did not like school or learning for most of my childhood. But as I got a bit older, some of my friends who also were interested in some of the same things like video games and so on, they got a bit older and started talking about politics and history. And, I think they had pretty good taste in movies and music, so when I think about some of these early influences, I think about The Matrix, which I saw when I was 8, and my brothers really liked that movie. And, I was exposed to that and it kind of blew me away, even though I didn't fully understand it. Um, and then getting into kind of certain bands like System of a Down, these sort of thoughtful political bands, right? It just made me, I would say it created a gap between like me and what was considered normal or acceptable. Or I could see, oh, there's a different way of talking, there's a different way of thinking. You could criticize the status quo. So I think, one aspect of a philosophical person is being somewhat independent or willing to criticize what's typical. And some of those artistic influences definitely put that in my head, that, they showed me a way of doing that sort of thing, right? And I was impressionable, and I didn't really have a religious upbringing, so I didn't have anything that would kind of protect me from these sort of influences, right? I didn't have like a rigid armor or something, right? Um, so I got interested in that, and then eventually I wanted to understand some of these conversations better. I wanted to be able to hold my own, so to speak, in these conversations, and I started reading a bit of philosophy, and I really loved it. Um, then I decided to major in it, and that was the point of no return.
Okay. So maybe that sort of brings us to this idea that you've expressed recently. We could jump around here a bit. Um, Mentioning the Matrix tempts me to go into some other stuff as well. Like, I mean, the Matrix is a lot on the topic of the question of what's true, of course, versus um, illusion or delusion. And I have a background in magic, illusionism, performing magic tricks, and so it's always been interesting to me to make note of how we misperceive reality and how perception and subjectivity often is not necessarily grounded in what's true and how easily tricked we are. And then the Matrix also, uh, it seems like it's sort of grounded in some maybe ancient Greek ideas. There's some, uh, seems to be maybe some Gnostic or Gnosticism, which I don't really have a clear definition of. I'm not sure if you want to go there at all, but and then the question of this concept you're working on now, the birth view, which is sort of like the worldview that you're sort of by default brought up into, right? Or that you sort of
Yeah.
adopt by default from the context of your early life, which again may or may not be grounded in what's true. And there's a lot of truth claims that are imposed on us or given to us. And so it's interesting, a lot of people do find different art or story uh, to be things that bring them to start questioning, maybe even rebelling against their birth view. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, so I have this idea. I wrote an article about it, and I've been kind of ruminating on it recently. This idea that everyone is born with a worldview, right? Um, and it's something you didn't choose, right? When you're conceived, you don't have a worldview, right? You're just blank. But at some point, right, you're going to start being enculturated into some part of the world, and that's going to significantly impact your beliefs, right? Your worldview, what you're exposed to, what you're not exposed to. And yeah, I think you're exactly right. Art, one of the main functions of art, you might think, is to present different pictures of what's possible or what the world is like, right? And for some people, I think this can be very shocking and jarring, right? That's why we see the censorship of art and images. And for me, yeah, the Matrix just showed me, I guess, very simply that, well, two things. Like, one, you have to choose for yourself, like whether you want to pursue what's real or not, right? So there's the kind of agency aspect of it, choice, and that this idea that you're kind of responsible to choose for yourself. And then the other thing is that, the world might not be how it seems, right? We might all be born into the Matrix. That's your birth view. Is this the Matrix birth view, right? Which is like 90s capitalism. So yeah, I think, I didn't choose to engage with those artworks, right? But they found a way into my life, and everyone has certain things, whether they're aware of it or not, that have significantly changed the kind of trajectory of their belief systems, right? And if you start to think about what those things are, you can kind of get a sense of what you haven't explored. You can kind of get a sense of the boundaries of yourself, right? The boundaries of the influences you've been exposed to. And I think that's important to realize that I am just not just a byproduct, but largely a byproduct of the images and sounds that have come into my brain and have kind of seeped their way into my soul, right?
So in your teaching, you're still, I suppose, expected to sort of go through some form of official curriculum, but has exploring, and I still want to go more in detail into the micro philosophy topic and what you're building, but is that influencing how you teach at all, and in helping students understand the usefulness of what they're learning?
Yeah, it's definitely had a big influence, and just as you said, like thinking about the stuff I'm teaching them as connecting to their actual lives, right? How can I present the curriculum in a way that matters to them as people? And I think there's a way to teach philosophy that, I'm guilty of it, where you present some set of ideas and it's kind of implied that they should care about it, right? Because it's the tradition, because these ideas are important and interesting and they're complicated, right? I've taught courses on Aristotle, for example, and you could easily just say, we're reading Aristotle. Like, if you don't care about this, or if you don't understand why this is important, like it's kind of your fault. You're missing something, right? Um, but I think I've become much more intentional about how I'm presenting and kind of ushering people into philosophy. And I think one of the most effective ways that has been missed in academia is focusing on experience, focusing on getting them to do exercises and activities where they can really have an experience with philosophy versus having this kind of purely consumption or receiving knowledge experience, right? If it's just me giving them knowledge and putting ideas into their head, right, that they might not stick. They might stick, they might not stick. But recently I taught a course for high school students on the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and I had the students actually go through the exercises that he performed himself as a way to kind of get Stoicism into his soul, right? And he did this every single day because, every day you wake up, there's going to be 10 different trivial human things you got to think about, worry about, right? So he started every morning with these sort of spiritual exercises as a way to start his day as a Stoic and make sure I remind myself of the fragility of human existence, right? That death is not truly bad for me, and so on. So I had the students go through these exercises, right? So they could see for themselves what it means to practice philosophy. And I had them do these exercises based on things from their actual lives, right? So it could actually connect with them as an individual, unique person and not just a generic kind of student, right? And I think that that is a really great way to bring people into philosophy, and they can immediately see its value for their lives. I don't have to explain it to them, right? And that's something I've been really trying to incorporate into my online courses and the articles I'm writing, is taking this different approach, right? And you could say it's borrowing from the Eastern traditions, right? We're going to actually do certain activities. We're not just going to read about them, right? So I've been really enjoying how that's affected my teaching, and I'm super excited about just going further into that approach. Yeah.
Yeah, I can really appreciate what you're up to with that, because I've had my problems with academia. Until grade 8, I was mostly homeschooled, and I was given a lot of opportunity to be creative, for one thing. And so even if I was learning mathematics, uh, I would struggle to just sit there and learn all the formulas if I wasn't doing anything with it. So then there's the question of why. Why am I learning this knowledge? Why am I acquiring this knowledge? And I'm really grateful that I had that opportunity to ask those types of questions and then find out sometimes, well, this type of knowledge can be quite useful and interesting and of value to something practical. And the topic of Stoicism eventually became, sort of post-academia, became of interest to me, and reading the letters of Seneca has been a profound experience for me. I'm less familiar with Marcus Aurelius, so I'm excited to check out you called it the Art of Living course?
Yeah. So, yeah, I just released a free course. Well, you can join now, but the first module will be available next week. But it's called Philosophy as the Art of Living. And it's a course through Marcus Aurelius's meditations. And there's a lot of courses about this already. But one thing I think that's unique about my approach is that, one, it's going to be directly based in the actual course I taught for these high school students. So that went really well, and I'm excited to see how people around the world kind of receive these exercises. And then two, it's, like I said, very practical. So you're not just going to learn about what he said or what Stoic philosophy is committed to. You're going to attach a practice and exercise to the text so you can really understand and meditate on the words and kind of use writing as a means to shape your own soul, essentially, to imprint your own words and concepts onto your soul. And that's what Marcus Aurelius tried to do with the Stoic words and concepts. So I'm super excited about that. Eventually, I would like to turn it into something even more ambitious, where I have a course on each philosopher who practiced philosophy as the art of living. But I'm just going to start with Marcus Aurelius for now and see how that goes. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm excited about that too. One of my problems with the academic world, or something that comes to mind right now, is what must be difficult for someone who wants to teach philosophy as the art of living is you do have to grade students on something, right? And they're expected to meet certain requirements to get a grade. And yet we could look at some of philosophy as um, a rebuttal against insufficient measurements and standards of value and success. So even going way back to Socrates, he was put on trial and sentenced to death for asking questions. And yet we study him like 2,500 years later as a moral example or as an example of philosophy. So it's interesting to consider that it's potentially true that in academia, a student who asks questions that are of immense value to their life might challenge the system in a way that doesn't get them the grades that they want.
Yeah, it's a big problem. I think grades are just an absolute mess, and no one really knows how to think about them. But um, it is true that there are certain questions that I've noticed which students have, which have been suppressed or dismissed. And a lot of what I'm trying to do on Substack and in the courses is actually take those questions seriously. For example, sometimes students wonder like whether the philosophy professor actually like practices their own philosophy. Like, how do you live, right? And in academic Western philosophy, that's typically dismissed as kind of irrelevant. Like, it doesn't matter. I'm just teaching you these things, and we're like engaging in this hypothetical discussion. It
Yeah.
doesn't matter whether I actually eat meat or not. And the students find that a bit strange sometimes that they're trying to learn about the importance of veganism from someone who's not a vegan, right? Um, and they're always kind of left wondering, like, do these ideas actually matter to the person who's explaining them to me or not? Because they're not practicing them, right? So um, I'm not saying that, we shouldn't be teaching certain things and that philosophy professors should only teach what they live by. But what I'm targeting is this idea that the question or the kind of puzzlement that the students have is like immature or some kind of irrelevant concern. And I think, again, that's rooted in this idea that philosophy is about acquiring research knowledge. So it doesn't matter how you live. You could be a meat eater or a vegan, and you could be really good at producing research, right? And that's what we're teaching you. Whereas if you think of philosophy as living a certain kind of life and demonstrating it and practicing it, right, then it does matter, like how you're actually living, and whether it's a good way of living or not, right? So yeah, how grades fit into that. It's tough, but students are definitely on to us sometimes, and we have to take what they're saying seriously and think about what philosophy means to them isn't necessarily right what it means to the professor who's been raised in a certain tradition, right? And I'm trying to kind of counterbalance that with some of the stuff I've been writing and entertain some of these thoughts and questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So, with a lot of the work that you're doing now, writing and journaling and self-inquiry is a big part of the process, right? Do you want to talk more
Yeah, for
about
sure.
the actual system that you're building, the micro philosophy, and how it works? Because I'm starting to go through it and just beginning still, but I've enjoyed it so far. I'm excited about it.
Yeah. So I do hope to do a kind of deep dive on the nature of writing as an act of like spiritual growth and so on. Because I've been thinking a lot more about the importance of writing. And my course, so the course again is called Micro Philosophy Foundations. And this is a 4-week course that's designed to help people go from having some idea of what their beliefs are to on the other end, having a kind of simple and clear structure or system where they can arrange those beliefs in a meaningful way and start to have a kind of deeper relationship to them, right? And in order to do that, you have to write. And it's not going to just your ideas are not just going to organize themselves, right? So, one thing writing does is it externalizes things inside of you, right? We have a running narrative in our heads, right? We might have a inner dialogue, but that is, in my experience, far less effective than writing. I think anyone who sits down to write their thoughts out will very quickly realize that they may not have understood things as well as they thought, right? Or they haven't really progressed in their thoughts internally. So they need to externalize things, right? They need to go deeper into them, and they need to go through this strenuous process of um, putting them to paper, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So one of the main components of the micro philosophy course is a writing component. And the reason I included that is because just knowing in your own head, like what your beliefs are, or what your worldview is, right? I think really limits us, and it limits our ability to explore that further, and also to consider how to kind of refine it and develop it in new ways. So the writing exercises, one thing they're trying to do is force people to really externalize their beliefs and systematize them, so that they can have some distance to them, and kind of look at them and really appreciate what they are, and how the words they chose speak to them. And if you don't do that, I fear that you will carry certain beliefs in your head, maybe your entire life, and you never really have any distance to them. They're just the kind of default code that you're running.
Mm-hmm.
So I think writing is a super powerful tool for spiritual progress, self development, and having a deeper relationship to yourself, right? Um, and that can come in many forms, journaling, etc. But this course is specifically getting people to write about their own worldview, their own picture of reality that they live by, so that they can more intentionally and consciously choose what beliefs they're going to put into practice.
Yeah. Yeah. So I find it interesting to consider how psychology, which my interest has more so, or I shouldn't say my interest, but my actual studies have led me more to studying psychology more closely than philosophy. But one of the major thinkers who has influenced me quite a bit would be Carl Jung, who, although is considered like a sort of a protege and later split with Sigmund Freud, he was deeply influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, who, again, I'm not that familiar with Nietzsche. I'm more familiar with where Jung kind of took his ideas, but Nietzsche seems to have been uh, very interested in the question of values and whether or not values are grounded in objective truth. And so maybe we could explore that a little bit. And Carl Jung came up with these ideas around archetypes and working on Freud's ideas, the collective unconscious, the personal unconscious, having content that even one's birth view would begin with that are sort of transpersonal beneath maybe the actual articulatable aspects of one's birth view. There'd be aspects of the psyche that are transpersonal that we all share. And so we all resonate with these great myths. And Joseph Campbell, of course, worked with Jung's ideas to write The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and his great works on the parallels between many of the great myths of mankind from around the world that on the surface have conflicting truth claims. But Jung's work, of course, is about, at the end of the day, it's about personal well-being. It was about a process of psychoanalysis that was for an individual person to develop and live a more healthy, cohesive life by integrating all these opposing aspects of the psyche and these kind of warring aspects of the unconscious that through some process he called individuation could become more integrated and whole or non-contradictory. So I know you've said Jung hasn't been someone you've studied closely, but it might be interesting for future conversations between us in thinking about philosophy as the art of living, to consider that bridge between philosophy and psychology.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something on my radar. A lot of people have asked me about the relationship between the micro philosophy and philosophy in general and psychology. Now, from what I know of Jungian psychology, right, it's not identical to like modern empirical psychology, right? This kind of study of the brain and mechanistic kind of thinking. So, that psychology is itself practiced in a lot of different ways. If you're approaching it through the brain and the kind of actual empirical limitations of the human mind and so on, right? That puts a lot of constraints on what philosophy can and can't be. So, depending on what you think psychology entails, right, it'll seriously affect how it relates to philosophy, right? I think Jung's approach is very philosophical, and like you said, a lot of other thinkers it resonates with from philosophy and other fields as well, right? Study of culture, myth, and so on. Modern psychology, from a kind of more scientific, brain-centric approach, right? The relationship between that and philosophy, I think, can be more antagonistic unless you adopt this sort of worldview, which is trying to reduce philosophy and things like spirituality to empirical science, right? And just touching on Nietzsche, because you mentioned him, for Nietzsche, his interest in values was, like you said, similar to Jung's, right? We need to create values that work for our lives, values that promote life, and values that promote our flourishing and our potential as people, right? So sounds similar to some of what Jung was suggesting, right? Why should you go through this painful, potentially scary process of self discovery, right? And personal development? Well, what's on the other side is, it's a version of yourself that is reaching its potential. It's a version of yourself that's more alive, right? That's not being undermined by the world and things you can't control, right? That's not living in a myth. It's a version of yourself that's more true to itself, right? So for Nietzsche, you need to question, for him, it was Christian moral values, right? He thought they denied our life potential and our creative energies. Why should you care about criticizing that? Well, if you value your own kind of personal development and reaching your own potential and self-mastery, right? If you value those things, you have to at least question. It doesn't mean you have to change your beliefs, right? But you do need to question them so that you can have more control and more agency over and authorship over your own life, right? The alternative is can often, unfortunately, be very sad, where people feel like their life has passed them by and they haven't really figured out who they are, and they are living according to things which aren't serving them, right? And they might be full of regret. So, there's an urgency there too. These things are difficult and important, and if you avoid them, right, then you might end up with life regret. You might end up feeling like you haven't come to know yourself, right? And that, I think, for human being, coming to feel like they know themselves is one of the most fundamental things that we desire in life, right? So I think philosophy and psychology um, have a similar aim there, right? But there are different aspects of that pursuit that we all kind of share, right?
Yeah. So I bet you quite a few people listening in on us, because of the nature of both of our audiences so far, they might be familiar with the idea of the creator economy, or some similar sort of concepts about the changing world landscape with the internet, and uh, how knowledge can be packaged up and distributed. So you're sort of contributing to a form of education that's a little more maybe decentralized in a way. You're still in the academic world, but you're also offering something that kind of offers uh, what a lot of education is meant to offer, in terms of drawing out the potential of an individual and helping them live a better life. And it's also offering what a lot of psychological work is kind of meant to offer, which is mental well-being. So, having a less fragmented mind and overcoming psychic entropy, or a more ordered psyche, uh, is very important, as you're saying. And you're able to tap into this sort of new creator landscape and make it worth your while. And that's really cool. Um, so I wonder what you have to say about what's going on here, and how did you stumble upon this possibility for yourself?
Yeah. So, when I was finishing my PhD, there were several years that went by where I noticed people doing things on YouTube and on the internet. And I always felt like that's something I wanted to do eventually, is create a kind of online philosophy school. And back then, I think the reason I wanted to do that was you can reach way more people. And I always viewed myself as someone who has a gift in making philosophy more accessible. And I really enjoy bringing people into the world of philosophy. I actually enjoy that more than speaking to experts and kind of speaking to the smallest, most accomplished audience, right? I'd much rather speak to the widest possible audience and have them understand why philosophy matters, right? And help them enjoy it, right? Because it is a difficult subject. The texts are difficult, the concepts are difficult, and so on. So I always was interested in that idea and viewed my kind of purpose as speaking to the masses rather than to the small minority of experts, right? But for a while, I didn't do anything with that, right? Making YouTube videos is a pretty high bar and so on. After I finished my PhD, though, I was starting to really question whether I wanted to be a full-time academic for the rest of my life, or start to pursue this kind of dream I've had in the back of my head. And after I finished my PhD, academic life got more difficult. Like the realities of being a philosophy PhD were starting to sink in, and I was going through some personal struggles as well. So I reached a point where I over time decided that, I'm not going to pursue an academic career full time for the rest of my life, right? I'm going to pursue this other thing. I've seen other people doing it, right? It's what really excites me now. And I think it's more in line with my strengths as a person. So I started working on that. And, since then, I've just like fully enjoyed it. It's just everything I hoped it would be. And one thing I like about it compared to traditional teaching is it does feel like I'm helping people on their kind of self-development journey. Whereas when I teach a normal class, there's almost a way in which it feels like the point of college is no longer to help young people develop. It's almost like this purely career based or intellectual thing, right? It's not about like helping people grow as a person. It's more about giving them this like technical skill or something so that they can, become a lawyer or, progress through this system of requirements. So, meeting people online has really changed how I view philosophy education and how it can help people on whatever their kind of spiritual, personal journey is, right? And it's a space where I can say things that I wouldn't be able to say in a traditional classroom, right? People aren't going to pay $80,000 a year to go take self-development courses at the university. They're paying to get skills to get a career, right? So online it's different. There's more freedom, and I think there's a real need that people have, especially older people who don't get as much access to education. um, they need guides. They need people to interact with who can help them with their struggles and help them on their personal journey. So that's what I really love about this creator economy. It's really about helping people in a way that meets them where they're at, and there's no kind of external restrictions imposed on what that looks like. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a cool thing. I'll share something with you that's kind of wild. I don't know if the term academy began with Aristotle, but I think he had the idea
So it
of,
started with Plato. Yeah.
okay,
But that's where, so that was just the academos is just this like garden temple in Athens where Plato would meet. So the name comes from the name of like the physical space and what it was used for. Yeah.
okay, academos. So um, I have these journals that I started years ago, like 2017, 2016 was the first one. I have two copies of this particular journal. It's a nice green bound book with a tree kind of etched into it. And I
Very
wrote,
nice.
might be hard to read there, but I wrote The Perennial Academy as the title.
Ah, it's a
And
great name.
thank you. So perennial means like ongoing in one sense. It also refers to plants, like people call plants that aren't annuals or biannuals. Plants like a shrub that lives a long time, they'll call it a perennial.
Mm,
And my interest in plants goes pretty deep. I'm interested in speculating about evolutionary biology and reading on that topic, and then also fungi, so botany and mycology. And there's lots of books on my shelf related to that. There's this fella, Tom Hatsis, will be on my podcast soon, and he wrote a new book
nice.
about some stuff going on in the whole psychedelic. He would call it like the third psychedelic renaissance,
Yep.
because those what some might call plant medicines, or what some might call dangerous hallucinogens, or depends on the perspective that you have on them. There's a lot of good science happening on therapeutic use that can be quite effective with mushrooms and plant substances like ayahuasca. And in this journal, first off, years ago, I wrote down a couple of names of people I'd like to learn from. And have you heard of Terence McKenna?
Yeah. So I've heard of him. I haven't read his work, but I've heard the name through Tool, which is one of my favorite bands, and
Yes.
they're very inspired by him. So
Yeah, I also like Tool. And so Terence McKenna, he died in 2001, I believe, or 2000, but became extra famous in the age of YouTube, when people then could reflect back on hundreds of hours of talks that he gave, mostly to fairly small audiences, and the books that he wrote. And his brother Dennis McKenna is still around and still engaged with working with these topics, plant medicines, and researching ayahuasca and attending conferences that are centered around that topic. So I wrote down, I'd like to learn directly from Dennis McKenna and also Wade Davis, who's quite a renowned anthropologist, the National Geographic explorer in residence for many years, and a great photographer, author of like 30 books. And I knew Wade was living in British Columbia, not that far from where I live. Dennis, I didn't even know. I knew he grew up in Colorado State. And it turns out he was in Minnesota at the time, I think he was still working at Minnesota State University or something. And I wrote their names down. I'd like to learn from them. A week later, I hear Dennis McKenna on a podcast announcing he's probably going to move to Canada, and he mentions the town that I live in. And then he says, I really want to go spend more time with my good friend Wade Davis. And then both of them, it's announced, will be at a conference I was already planning to attend. I had been to it previous years. So
Nice.
At the University of British Columbia. So I thought, okay, that's kind of strange. I wrote their names down in this Perennial Academy notebook, and here they're showing up in my life. And so I have done interviews with both of them that are published in written form. And I'm hoping to have Dennis on my podcast now that I'm doing this.
Great. Yeah.
So that was strange. Now let's jump to more recent, because we're touching on this creator economy topic. So I'm bringing that back. I also wrote down recently some friends and I, who you're aware of some of them, like Hussein Ibarra is a great writer who's quite successful writing on the platform X, and a few others. I thought, man, it sure would be cool to get all these people together at a convention. There's a lot of us interacting in these online spaces. A lot of us use Dan Koh's writing program, Cortex. And I thought, man, we should all meet in person. And so I had this vision of, let's make a convention happen with like 300 tickets available. And I wrote down some names in the Perennial Academy notebook. I said, I'd like to, as headline speakers, it sure would be cool if we could have Dan Koh. It sure would be cool if we could have Dan Goldfield, who's a teacher who talks about meditation and spirituality in a sort of unique way. And then it sure would be cool to have Brian Meyerhofer, who is a somatic therapist and also doing very well writing online and sharing courses to help people heal from all kinds of physical conditions and heal chronic pain. And he's helped me out. And then I wrote down also Kimia Nora, who I've seen her posts about neuroplasticity and nervous system regulation. I thought, I like her posts. She seems to be doing very well, but I didn't really know much about her. So I logged on to X right after writing those names down to take a look and see if she also maybe has a YouTube or something. Before I could do that, a little notification pops up on the bottom of the screen saying there's a live call happening right now with Dan Goldfield and Brian Meyerhofer. Would you like to tune in? I'm like, what the heck? I got to be careful whose names I write down in this journal, hey? So
Yeah. Is this like Death? I hope it's not like Death Note.
I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Is that a show or
It's an
something?
anime. So it's an
Oh,
anime, and the premise is that there's a book where if you write people's names in it, then they die.
oh
This is
well.
the opposite. This
So,
is Life
yeah, so
Note.
far it's going great. I write people's names down and it builds community and people come together and show up. So then I told them, Dan Goldfield and Brian Meyerhofer, about this, and they were both like, heck yeah, let's do this convention. So I won't ramble about it too much because I'm sure I'll mention it in the intro or outro or both of this podcast. But I know you've expressed interest, and suddenly all these people are expressing interest, and people who seemed kind of maybe maybe hard to reach or hard to convince because they're big time creators and they've got a big audience and they're building their businesses, their one person businesses or personal brands. All of them are saying, yes, I want to come to this convention and speak. So this is really exciting. And I hope to see you there. And I hope there's a lot of people I hope to see there. And Vancouver, British Columbia next May, at the end of May.
Yeah,
We're gonna
I
do it.
plan on being there. Yeah, it's
Excellent.
super exciting. And I think just to touch on the creator economy topic again, this is one of the cool things about it, right? It's that people are accessible,
Yeah.
even with a large audience, right? Whereas, you know, in academia, it's not the same. You can't necessarily access a world-renowned scholar, right? And they might not even be interested in coming to talk to these random people or something, right? So, people are getting more direct access to the people that they need to help them with whatever, if it's health, if it's spirituality, philosophy, whatever, right? And I think ultimately that's, if that model keeps working and growing, right, I think the world would be better for it. We want less paywalls between people and what they need, right? A university has put up massive financial barriers to education, at least in the United States, right? And I was a first generation low income student. I went to study philosophy with no money and had $80,000 in debt from that degree. And that was my passion, right? And that was a price I had to pay to pursue my passion, right? I don't think people should have to pay $80,000 to study philosophy. So yeah, it's a new world that's being, it's a new order. Honestly, it's a new economy, and I think it's going to serve people better.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm running my creative wayfinder cohort, kind of applying some Jungian shadow work and applying things like flow state science and things I've learned from a variety of thinkers and packaging it up and running live calls with people who get together as a group and talk about their various creative paths. And people are seeming to have great impact in their lives from it. Um, and it's building community and it's accessible, and so that's exciting too. It's just amazing that you can start where I was 8 or 9 months ago, thinking, um, I don't have the ability to package something up that people are willing to pay for that's really going to impact them, and then learning from some of these creators who are doing it and explaining how to start writing on the internet and then iterating on the ideas until you start to find out how to create something really valuable and cohesive. So, do you have anything to share for people who are maybe earlier on in their online creator journey, trying to figure out how to enter in to that world?
Yeah. So while you were speaking, one thing I thought about was fear. And one of the reasons I think I committed to pursuing being a creator is that I wanted to face certain fears. I wanted to put my thoughts on the internet and publish them and um, get feedback and have to improve, right? Instead of hiding behind a kind of predetermined career or role where the title kind of told other people, oh, well, this person has this title, right? What they're doing matters because they have this title or something. So for me, it was very personal, and part of my personal development is facing this fear by putting things online and letting them be seen and judged and trying to make them better, right? And not just avoiding those difficult feelings of facing, the fact that you aren't such a good writer, right? That you do need to get better. So going through that process for me has been really beneficial. And I think, a lot of people who are just starting, it is very scary, but I have been blown away by the overwhelmingly positive community I found. 98% of people I interact with are pleasant and supportive and exciting and, say valuable things back to me that help me grow. So even though it's scary, I think, what you're going to find is a lot of people who support and appreciate the fact that you are trying to do something interesting, right? Because that's what makes the world a fun place to be is that people just try to make cool stuff for other people to enjoy. Um, and especially today, people are tired of consuming things from these mega corporations. They want authentic, personal, handmade stuff that real people are making that they can talk to. So people need you to get over your fear and start making the things that you're able to make.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah. And I would recommend that people go check out your Microphilosophy Foundations program because, for one, like you talked about earlier, you can sort of live with this unquestioned birth view that maybe doesn't really serve you that well, and uh, live a lot of your life unexamined, partly because it is scary to examine, and your identity. Some people have written about this topic of how, we uh, animals in general mostly live to make sure their bodies and genes survive, but we have somehow spend a lot of energy trying to make sure our identity survives, and we want a lot of social reassurance that our identity is true and accurate. And yet, if you're going to dive deep into questioning your worldview, you're going to have to maybe give up some things that you feel like are part of your identity, and it's going to have to change. So the survival of your identity is a default motivator that sort of has to be overcome, and the fear of change has to be overcome. And in the microphilosophy foundations work, um, I think that'll help a lot of people get more clear on what their values are, what their beliefs are, and also how they do and don't want to live. So to actually step back and, like you say, like how writing helps you to externalize what's inside, you can step back from these beliefs and visions for your life and see, um, oh, okay, if I just continue with my worldview and identity as it is, there's aspects of what I don't want in my life that are just going to be part of my life. And there's a lot that I really do want for my life that won't happen without that taking that time to examine it. So I think what you're doing is great for people in general, and for people who are looking to sort of become a part of this creator economy space, and maybe teaching philosophy isn't their thing. Maybe it's something more in the world of, well, it could be that they want to teach painting, or it could be anything.
Yep.
To do that work and examine that way, I think really helps, because to build a brand, you have to speak to people's anti-vision and vision, right? To resonate deeply with something deeper that people want out of life, and then to show clearly that there's something you can provide that will give them more access to the vision and greater ability to avoid the anti-vision. And I think you're really hitting the nail on the head with what you're creating.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate that. And I do think it's connected to the vision, anti-vision, personal brand, all these things that people are starting to learn about as they venture into this online entrepreneurship, solo business world. Behind your vision is some set of values, right? If you imagine your ideal future, what are the values that are underneath that, right? What are the beliefs? What kind of world does your ideal self live in your vision, right? And also, same with the anti-vision, right? What kind of world, what values would fail to be met in such a world, right? Also with the brand, personal branding, thinking about, who am I? How do I present my ideal image of myself in the world? How do I present that, right? What holds it together? I think a lot of those questions fundamentally depend on some kind of personal philosophy that you have, right? And belief change. I think a lot of energy is spent on the internet trying to get people to change their habits, their actions. But if you only start changing your habits and your actions without changing your beliefs and understanding the connection between your beliefs and your actions, right? Those habits are not going to stick, and you're not really going to be able to recreate yourself, right? You might be able to floss and meditate regularly, right? But what a lot of people want is to either understand themselves and have a deeper relationship with themselves, or to start changing some of these default modes of being that they've inherited that aren't serving them, right? So it's not all about changing who you are. It's a lot of it's just about figuring out where you're at so that you can choose what's next for yourself, right? So my goal in my work is to help people just kind of figure out, where am I, and like give them the opportunity to ask and choose whether to keep going or not, like you said. So yeah, it's all I think useful for many different people, and it's something that human beings, I think, have a deep craving for, is self knowledge and autonomy, right? So that's really what it's all about. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fun conversation. I have a couple last questions if you can
Sure. Yeah.
answer these to close on. One would be, do you want to give us a sneak preview of any of the next philosophers you're going to focus on for the philosophy as the art of living?
Oh, so yeah, the first one's going to be Marcus Aurelius, and that will that course will be released over the next couple weeks. Most of it I've already done before. After that, there's a pretty long list, but some figures on the list are Nietzsche, Montaigne, Socrates, Buddha, obviously. Yeah, so we'll see. But, a lot of these philosophers that people deeply resonate with, right? They all have this in common. And I don't think that's an accident, that the people who we most resonate with are the ones who are teaching us how philosophy intersects with our actual lives, right? And not just solving these kind of logical puzzles and so on. But yeah, I'm excited especially about Nietzsche. that'll be a that'll be a fun one.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that one. I've long wanted to dive into Nietzsche, and I find him intimidating from the bit of reading. And I did try to read Thus Spake Zarathustra like 15 years ago, but I wasn't in the position to deeply reflect on it. So
Yeah, but the issue with the Nietzsche course is that one of the exercises is going to require a mountain because he was a big hiker. So that might limit the audience for that course if you don't live by a mountain.
yeah, well, you'll have to come to British Columbia to the convention next year and join us for some hikes. There's some great mountains. Final question for you, because my podcast, being the Unblocked Creators, my hope is to attract a lot of people to uh, fulfill their artistic desires and to become unblocked creators. And so maybe this is a bit of a two-part question. One is like, from a philosopher's point of view, what is a little bit more you could say about the role of art? Is it important? And then what would you say about creativity as something that can be blocked or perhaps unblocked?
Yeah, big questions at the end, but let me try to
I trust
keep
it.
it brief. So yeah, so Nietzsche obviously is famously known for thinking that art is kind of fundamental to human life, and creating great art is one of our kind of highest purposes in life, right? It gives life meaning. It affirms the human spirit, right? Um, so Beethoven in particular is an example of someone who suffered in order to, express the human spirit as profoundly as he could, right? So art, I think, is at least for someone like Nietzsche, really important to helping us overcome our suffering and um, get in touch with our common humanity, right? And also our potential as people. So that's, I'll just leave it at that for the first question. The second one, could you remind me again, is how do we not become blocked?
Yeah, what have you learned about unblocking your creativity?
Yeah, so writing on Substack has completely broken open my creativity. I never thought of myself as a creative person, and I always wanted to be. I played guitar and things like that, but I just felt like I don't know how to be creative. And then I started publishing articles, and by lowering the kind of expectations and um, just honestly writing authentically about the things I cared about, right? Um, that made me start to realize that there is something I want to say. And once that process started, it's kind of now spiraled out of control in a good way, where I have like so much that so much creative energy and not enough time to turn it into what I envision. So for me, it was the fact that I was writing things that I really wanted to write about, and I was interacting with other people and sharing it with them, which created a feedback loop. And then it started to help me figure out what to read, what to write about next. That combination has exploded my creativity, and I had never expected that to happen, and I'm so grateful that it did. Yeah.
Amazing. I'm grateful too, and it's inspiring to watch. I've read quite a bit of your work, and I want to keep reading more of it. And I definitely see your writing has evolved over time, and so that's really cool. Cool to see. And what you just said kind of reminds me of something I just pulled out from one of your earlier writings. You quoted one of your professors in the past telling you there are only two things you need to do in life to be successful: show up and don't panic.
Yep.
Loved that.
It gets you pretty far, to be honest.
Well, man, thank you so much. I'm really glad to have had you say yes to joining me on the show, and I'll look forward to future conversations and the evolving friendship and the evolving community that we're building together. So very exciting.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been fun. Can't wait to do it again, and good luck with the planning of this event. Can't wait. I'm definitely gonna do everything I can to be there, and I think it's gonna be awesome. So
I think so. Well, thank you, Paul, and we'll talk to you
great.
soon.
Talk soon. Yeah.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Unblocked Creators. This was a lot of fun. Thanks, Paul Muso, for being an excellent guest. And if you want to get your ticket to the Creator Economy Convention, tickets go on sale at an early bird founder price on August 15th, 2025. And over the coming months, prices will go up to full price. So, at the early bird founder price, there will be a release of 50 tickets at $295 US and just $70 for the Friday dinner, Saturday lunch, and Sunday lunch. All part of the general admission tickets. So, over the months, prices will eventually go up to full price at about $495. So I highly recommend getting them now and booking your hotels, booking your flights, and getting to this event. The venue is just 10 minutes from the Vancouver airport. There's a free shuttle to get back and forth 24 hours a day. The hotel at the Sheraton, if you get a room at the Sheraton, there's a gym, there's a pool. It's going to be an absolute blast. On Sunday night, there will be an after party, tickets sold separately, and announcements about that will be made as time goes on the Substack publication. So go follow the Living Internet Alliance on Substack. Again, the link to that is in the description of this episode. Can't wait to meet in person, and I hope you enjoy the next one.